Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this 2500 watt Craftsman generator. This machine is powered by an overhead valve Tecumseh engine and appears to be in pretty good shape. It's virtually rust free. I don't see any parts missing or broken. That said though, I don't really know much about this machine. My buddy Jason got actually 3 machines in a deal for $100 and he dropped them off for us to get up and running again. So I thought I'd start with this machine because this seems to be in the best shape of the 3, but it's not a slam dunk either. Although the engine rotates and feels good, and I can hear the piston going up and down, I don't feel any compression. So likely we have an issue with the valves. If we're really lucky, we just need to adjust them. Otherwise we could have a stuck valve or possibly a bent valve. So that is what we're going to find out today. And with any luck, by the end of this video, we'll have this machine up and running again. So let me set up a little bit better and get going on this. So first things first, let's check the oil, make sure it didn't run out. And no, there's actually plenty of oil. It looked to be filled to the full mark, which is a good sign. Maybe a little bit below, but there is plenty of oil. We are in the safe zone. So, it does need to be changed, but let's get the engine running first, and then we'll worry about changing that oil. And let's see what we have for an air filter. That'll give us a little clue as far as what we're in store for. Okay. Well, at least it had a filter. A little bit dirty. There is a little dirt that snuck by the filter, so we're going to have to keep that in mind. Potentially, that could be a clue as to why this engine has no compression. Anyway, let's pull the plug, get the compression tester in there, and just make sure we are, in fact, missing compression. So the plug that came out looks actually not too bad. There's not a lot of buildup. It is a little dark. Very little wear, though, on the electrode. Anyway, it's a Champion RN4C. So let's get the compression tester in there and see where we're at. So keep an eye on the compression tester. This engine has a decompression system, so usually you won't see anything above 60 psi. In this case, I think we're going to be quite a bit lower, if not 0. So we'll give it a few pulls. Oh, we got something. So we're not at 0. Actually, it looks closer to 30 psi. So yeah, this might run. Potentially the valves just have a bit of rust on it. And if we run this for a second or two, that compression could come right back. So let's get a little bit of fuel right down the spark plug hole. We'll try to start it and do another compression test. But before we do that, let's just check and make sure we have spark. All right, the ignition's on. Keep an eye right there. Yeah, I hear it, and I can see it. Good. All right, let's try this out. Ignition's on. This machine doesn't have a choke. It has a primer. So we're going to help it out just a bit. And assuming it starts, I might feed it a little more starting fluid. I want to keep it running, make sure the engine sounds good, and verify that the generator is making power. But yeah, this machine, there is no detectable compression stroke. Like that rope should get hard to pull at some point, and it just doesn't. So regardless of whether this starts or not, I think at a minimum we got to check the valves because something is not right here. Okay, well the engine sounds good. We're making power. Question is, does it feel any better? And the answer is no. I don't think that compression increased at all. But let's throw the tester on there and just make sure. All right, same test. And pretty much the same result, 30 psi. And it looks like to get the valve cover off, we just have a bolt in each corner, actually bolts on the top, nuts on the bottom, although we're missing that one. And this one is apparently already loose. So yeah, someone's already been in here chasing this problem. Anyway, let's get the one remaining nut off. You know, we got to lift this heat shield out of the way, and then we should be free to remove the rest. So the fact that someone's already been here, probably not a good sign. I guess best case scenario, they did something wrong and we can fix it. I'm thinking they already tried that, and well, we still don't have the right compression. I think we need to pull the air box because it's kind of sandwiching this in place, although, yeah, we'll just pull it. That was loose, and so was that. Huh. There we go. Yeah, and the valve cover's not even stuck. Usually you gotta free the gasket. Someone already did that for us. Yeah, we got some rust, so that is not a good sign. Although the valves are tight. So the exhaust is open. Actually, that's the intake. And the exhaust is tight. So this actually could be an easy fix. Now the exhaust is open and the intake has clearance. So the exhaust valve is definitely a problem. Whether it's the only problem, I don't know. So let's crack that adjuster loose, set the valves, and I'm willing to bet the compression will come up a bit. So to set the valves, you want to be on top dead center. And usually I cheat and just rotate the engine until one of the valves is open. In this case, the exhaust is open. So then we can set the intake. That's probably the best way to do it, just because it doesn't require a lot of understanding of what's going on here. But to do it correctly, the piston should be at top dead center. What a lot of people don't realize is that the piston's at the top twice, and only once is the compression stroke, and that is the stroke you want to be on. So if you want to do it that way, I recommend putting your thumb over the spark plug hole, rotating the engine until you feel compression, and then you know you're on the compression stroke, and then just shine a light down there and keep rotating until the piston's at the top. In this case, that's not going to work too well because the compression is so low. So instead, you can just watch the valves, and you need to know which valve is which. So in this case, this is the intake, that's the exhaust, and you want to rotate it slowly. I see the exhaust is closing, which means the piston's actually at the top. It just finished pushing the exhaust out. So if I keep going, the piston's going to go back down, the intake will open, and that's pulling in air and fuel. And when that valve closes, the piston should now be on its way up. And that's where you want to shine a light down and just rotate the engine until that piston's at the top or just a little bit past. Which is right there. So I've already cracked this nut free. There is a jam nut down here, and it's actually pretty tight on this valve to get to. Crow's foot wrench would work better. Thankfully, it freed up without too much effort. So I'm just going to check it first with a 2000s feeler gauge. And yeah, that is super tight. There is pretty much no clearance there. So let's back that out a little. And we'll get the 10,000s feeler gauge. And if anything, I might go on the low side of this spec. 10,000s, that is a lot. So let's use the 9,000s feeler. And we're not there yet. Here we go. That feels pretty good right there. So let's tighten up the lock nut, and then we'll check the intake. That's pretty much as tight as I can get it, which I'm not feeling too good about. So let me try a different wrench. Maybe I can get in there at a slightly different angle. No, the tank's in the way. So yeah, I guess we could remove the tank, but it seems kind of unnecessary to just adjust the valves that you have to remove the tank. But it's kind of looking like that might be needed here. So I think I'm just going to get the intake out of the way. That might let me get the wrench in, from this side. Might need to pull the stud as well. But this is definitely probably the easier way to do it. Not that pulling the tank is that hard. There we go. pretty tight at 9. Let's snug that bolt up a little bit. And this plate shifted as well. So yeah, this plan may backfire here. Let me center that plate. Nine is loose again. 10 actually feels pretty good. And 11 doesn't fit. So the exhaust valve, I think, is good. So I'm going to spend a second, just clean the rust off the valve we did remove, and then we'll set the clearance on that one as well. So we'll get this reinstalled, and actually that way. Okay, so right there we're at 0 valve lash, and we want to back that out to 4 thousandths. I'm going to do that a tight 4 thousandths because I think that's going to open up a little. Yep, and it did open up. So let's close it. So right there, actually the feeler gauge doesn't move. And now it does. It actually feels pretty good right there. Maybe even loose still. Let's check a 5. And no, 5 is super tight. So the valves, they should be set now. So I'm going to get the plug back in, and we'll just pull the engine over, see if I can actually feel the compression stroke. And assuming I can, I'll get the compression tester back in there, and we'll see where it's at. Okay, so right now the engine's easy to pull, and now we just hit compression. And it requires more force to pull through it. So that is a big improvement from last time. So I'm going to get a little bit of oil up here on the top end. It's pretty dry. We'll get the cover back on, and then do the compression test. Surprisingly, the gasket came off clean. So I cleaned up the cover. Just get this reinstalled. Same test as last time. but I think we're going to see a lot more than 30 PSI. Yeah, we're already at 40, 50, 60. Yeah, and it looks like we stopped at 60. So that's where we should be. The engine feels a lot better when pulling it over. So I guess fuel is probably going to be the next challenge here. But let's feed a little bit of fuel in the tank and see if this carb shows any signs of life. It looks like the tank is clean and dry, so that is a good sign. So I'm just going to add a little bit of fuel. There is actually no fuel valve, so if the needle and seat aren't working, then it's just going to flood and make a pretty big mess. So yeah, let's get some fuel in there and see what happens. So when you depress the primer, you should get a shot of fuel right up that emulsion tube. And I'm not seeing anything. So yeah, most likely the fuel isn't making it into the bowl. And actually the bowl is pretty rusted too. So chances are the carb does need to be cleaned. So we'll prime it manually and we'll try to start it. Same test as before. Hopefully a different result. I can't believe it, but this machine, it's trying to live. It started the first pull, and for a second there, I thought it was going to keep running on its own, but it did start to die, and this carb does not have a choke. So, I manually choked the engine, and it recovered. So the carb, it is trying, but it is dirty and definitely needs to be cleaned. So we'll do that in a minute, but I guess first, since we have some heat in the engine, we should change the engine oil. We have a drain bolt right there, but that is going to make a terrible mess. Let's see if we have one on the other side. And surprisingly, we have a cutout to do an oil change, but no actual bolt. So yeah, someone wasn't talking to someone when they came up with this design. So I think I'm going to do the easy thing instead. We'll just siphon the oil out and get some fresh stuff in its place. According to the manual, this takes 20 ounces of oil, so I've pre-measured it. Might not add at all because the siphon, although it gets most of the oil, doesn't get all of it. So there could be a little bit left in there. Yeah, it looks like we were filled right to the full mark. Good. So I'm back adjusting the valves again. And the one saying that comes to mind is we do it right because we do it twice. So that spec I gave earlier of 10,000ths of an inch on the exhaust was completely wrong. You know, it seemed wrong. So I went back and checked, and that 10,000ths actually was not 10,000ths. It was 100,000ths, and not inches, but millimeters. So yeah, this engine is a little different, or I should say that document is a little different than most, because usually you list two numbers for valve clearances, the intake and the exhaust. And this document decided to save some space because the spec is actually the same. It should be 4,000ths on each. So I need to adjust this down a bit to 4,000ths. So I'm going to take care of that, and then we'll move on. So we'll get the carb off, actually starting with the fuel lines. Let me move you to that side. And it is usually easier to get the clamp and the line off first. At least break the line free, because once you pull the bolts holding the carb onto the manifold, you don't quite have as much holding things in place. And this line, you really need to break it free, at least get it to twist. Like right now, it's kind of glued or stuck in place, but now it did break free, so it is spinning. So that should come off pretty easily. And same thing with the breather. So let's get the bolts out of the carb, disconnect the linkage, and I think that fuel line will come right off. And just take note of where that linkage is. You know, Tecumseh carbs, they have lots of different positions to put that governor rod connection, depending upon the application. If you put it in the wrong spot, the engine's definitely not going to run right. Thought that line was going to come right off, but it's kind of fighting me. So I'm going to put one of the nuts back on just to kind of hold things still. And we will get that fuel line off. Now there is fuel in the tank. There is no fuel valve. So I'm also going to use some fuel line pliers or clamps to stop that fuel flow. All right, let's have a look. And despite all the dirt on the outside, I actually think it's going to be pretty good in here based on the fact that it ran. And it was running better the more we let it run. So, you know, the carb actually smells like old fuel. So I'm willing to bet, although the tank was dry and empty, likely the carb was not the same way. So if we'd let it run for a few more minutes, I'm thinking it might have cleared out most of that old fuel in here and potentially kept the engine running without any help. So main jet, a little bit dirty, but not too bad. Let's see what the bowl looks like. Oh yeah, that's not good. So definitely, well, some old fuel, but most of that is actually water mixed with debris. You can kind of see the fuel line right there. It's just a very small fuel line, so a majority of that is actually water. And it's hard to tell because it is so dark and murky, but you can also see a water line down there. So that would definitely cause a run issue. I'm surprised it was running at all. Needle not stuck. Float doesn't look great. And yeah, the rest of it actually not too bad. So it's really from the float down that needs a good cleaning. So let's get the pin out, get the float and the needle out. And on this carb, I was going to say that's pretty much it, but we might have a removable pilot jet there. So we'll take a closer look at that. I think we just have a plastic cap covering that up. And once we get that off, we should be able to get that jet out as well. Yeah, needle looks pretty good actually. So no issues with that. And the float doesn't look good. I don't hear any liquid in it. These brass floats, they do tend to corrode and fail. So you want to be careful and just always check them. Make sure they're not leaking. And as far as the cap goes, let's see if we can get that out. Actually, it may not be a cap. I'm not sure what that is. It is moving though. Maybe it's just so old that it's kind of disintegrating. Okay, yeah, it is a cap. It's just an old one, and there's the jet right there. So we'll get that out, go through all the passages, and this is definitely going to need a good soak in the ultrasonic. And it's just a tiny little jet. So these clog up pretty easily. So let's run through that and all the passages and just make sure they're clear. And there's a tiny little passage here on the side, and that is the pickup for the pilot circuit. So you want to make sure that's open. And it was. And the pilot jet, yeah, that one's also open. So none of the jets were clogged. I think really the big issue with this carb was all the junk that was inside of it. So now that that's out, a quick clean, we should be good. So the carb cleaned up really well. That said, though, we're not out of the woods yet. I was looking down here and noticed that the seal seems to be out of place. And if you look even closer, the emulsion tube, which is made out of plastic, also appears to be broken. So, I usually don't take these out because they are plastic. They tend to break. But since this one's already damaged, I think we have no choice but to get that out and replace it with one that is not split at the bottom. Okay, it moved. Let me get an Allen wrench, of the right size, and usually you can use that to push down on the emulsion tube, and with any luck, this one will come out. Yeah, it's moving, but pretty slowly. Okay. So, yeah, the bottom appears to be broken. I think there's usually a little bit more length to that. So, I do have some parts carbs, and this one appears to have the same red emulsion tube, although I say that, now that I'm looking at it, it could also be pink. There are different colors. Haven't found a decode as far as why there's different colors, but I've got to imagine it matters for some reason. And this one, actually, I would say it's red, but it is potentially pink. And this carb is definitely shot, as far as I'm concerned. So it is a parts carb, so let's see if we can get this one out. And I might actually just try the screw, because that seems to work a lot better. You just have to be really careful that you don't drive it in too far, because you will crack the plastic. Yeah, it moved a little bit. This one's a little bit more difficult just because of the condition of the carb. And it has a choke plate, so it's not too easy to push down. It is removable, though, so we could remove it, which it's looking like we might have to. Well, let's try the Allen key. Yeah, so this one's a different color. And we also have an O-ring here on the top. So either that one was missing on this carb or it stayed behind. Yeah, it stayed behind. So we got that out. Both of those O-rings are pretty swollen and distorted. And actually same for the emulsion tube we just pulled out. So the fact that these are different colors, I think, is going to preclude us from using the one we just pulled out. Let's pull this O-ring off. I just want to see what the bottom looks like. Of course, this O-ring is absolutely petrified. And yeah, you can see on the red one, there is a little bit of damage. It's actually not as bad as I thought. You know, potentially we could reuse that emulsion tube with some new O-rings, but I do have a whole bin of parts carbs, and it looks like I distorted it as well when removing it. So we definitely need a new one of these, or at least one that's in better shape. So there are quite a few different colors. This one is blue. We have this one here, which looks to be pink. And we also have another one here, which is green. So those colors do signify something. I need to find that decode chart. But what I do know is what I need to know is that we need a red one. And I actually found 2 other carbs with the part we need. So let's try to get it out without causing any damage. This carb looks pretty good inside. A little newer design. It has the plastic float. So we'll try gently to push this down without causing damage. Yep, that one came right down. And then I'm going to use the smaller Allen wrench to hopefully push it the rest of the way out. Like that. Maybe. Okay, good. That one survived. Looks to be the same. So we'll get some new O-rings on it and get it installed. So we'll start by just getting this pilot jet back in. And then we'll get the needle and the float. Float height looks good. This O-ring, it's a little bit suspect. It is cracked in a few spots, and the bowl actually needs a good seal, or the primer isn't going to work. So I do have a new O-ring, which looks to be the right size. So we'll get that in place. Like that. And then I'm going to put the emulsion tube in along with the main jet. That way we know these new O-rings are seated properly. You know, what can happen is that if you put this O-ring on, the bottom one in, and then you just push it in, you know, that O-ring could potentially come off. But if you put it together, or push it down, I should say, with the main jet, you know, that O-ring is likely to stay in place. So I am going to start it. There we go. Then the bowl, making sure that this mark right here is kind of in alignment with the pin. Okay, let's try it out. So we're not quite done yet. I thought I'd check the primer for cracks or leaks, so I pulled it back just a bit and it split right open. So we need to get a new one of these installed before trying it out. So there's a metal ring going around here. It's a push fit and it doesn't unscrew. You got to pry it out. So to get that out, actually the easiest thing to do is to remove the rest of this rubber. It's just kind of in the way. And once removed, it'll give you a little bit better access and a little bit better view to that piece of metal, which you can see right there going around. So I'm just cleaning up the surface here. And installing the new one's a lot easier. This piece that came out is kind of like a push nut. It's meant to go in and not really come out, at least not without bending and deforming it. But to get it in, the right size socket, you should be able to push it in and just tap it lightly until it's seated. So we get the new primer bulb, put that in place, make sure it's seated. And then the push nut, it's not the same on both sides. You see the side facing down is kind of bent. So you want those bends actually facing up. And then I have a few sockets here that fit. The 18 seems like it's going to work best, but 3/4 inch also seems to fit. But let's try the metric one. And actually, that one's a little tight. Yeah, 3/4 inch is better. Okay, so I'm going to fill the carb up first. We'll test it, make sure it works. And if it does, then we'll get it installed. All right, so the bowl, it is full of fuel, and we want to test the function of the primer. So to do that, you would think you just push the primer, and you should see fuel coming out of that red emulsion tube. But of course, in this case, we see nothing. And the reason for that is because this bolt hole for the air box, it's actually a through hole into the primer system. And if that's open, it's not going to push fuel through the system. So you actually need to either put the bolt in there or cover up the hole. And then if we do the same test, you can see we get a shot of fuel. So the primer, it's good. So we'll start just by connecting up this governor linkage, being sure that it goes in the right spot. Okay, so we've got the cleaned up carb on, ignition's on. I'll give it 2 pumps. All right, not too bad. That engine started first pull. It ran nice and smooth. So the carburetor, it is doing a very good job running the engine. The engine speed, though, was a little bit slow. So I increased the spring tension and brought that no-load speed up to 61.5 Hertz. And at that speed, the voltage was at 125 volts, which on the surface sounds good. My concern, though, is the regulator on this machine. It's not an automatic voltage regulator, so machines like this usually lose about 20 volts from no load to full load. So that would suggest the voltage at full load would be about 105 volts. And unfortunately, there's not a whole lot that can be done about that other than bringing the speed up even more. Technically, we could probably bring it up to 62 or 62.5 if we needed a little bit more voltage. But I'm inclined to kind of leave it where it is. I guess we'll find out when we test it just how low the voltage gets. So let's get the heat shield back on. We'll get the air box back on. We'll roll this outside, put it to the test, and see what it can do. So let's see if this shield will go back on. The problem with it is that it got dented in on the right side. But yeah, actually went on a lot easier than it came off. And we'll get the nuts back on, or actually I should say nut. The other one was missing, but I did find some hardware that can be used on the other side. So I'm going to get that old filter replaced with a brand new one. And we'll secure this down. And then we'll be ready. All right, I think we're pretty much ready to go here. So this machine It only has 120 volts output. There is no 240, so we can't use the load bank. Instead, we're just going to use these two 120 volt resistive heaters. Now, the machine, it's rated at 2500 continuous watts. And actually the horsepower on this engine is 6 horsepower, so it should have no problem getting up to 2500, assuming that the engine is healthy. And technically, this engine should be able to pull up to 3000 watts. So we are going to test that. But the plan is just to get the engine started, while it's warming up, we'll double check the output. We'll measure the frequency and the voltage using the kilowatt. We'll take a look at the sine wave using the oscilloscope, as well as the total harmonic distortion. We'll then put the heater on the right on full, which is 1500 watts, double check the outputs, and then we'll put this one on low. So that'll bring the total load up to 2250 watts, just below the rated wattage. And then we'll try to bump it up to 1500 watts. So in total, we'll be pulling 3000 watts. So no issues at all getting the machine started first pull, and the engine sounds really good. So I don't think we're going to have any problems here, but I may have just jinxed myself. Anyway, the no load speed surprisingly came up a little bit from where I set it. We're just over 62 Hertz, and the voltage is about 130 volts. So given this doesn't have a voltage regulator, I think I'm going to leave that alone. I think that's where it needs to be. So without a load, sine wave doesn't look great, and the total harmonic distortion is about 8.8, maybe about 9%. So we'll give this a minute or so, then we'll put on a load of 1500 watts and see how it does. So the voltage actually came down quite a bit for a 1500 watt load. We're sitting at about 110 volts, and the engine speed came down quite a bit as well. We're around 58, maybe 58.3. So I don't think I'm going to try and overload with this. I think we'll be lucky to pull 2,250 watts. So under this kind of a load, sine wave looks a little bit better. And total harmonic distortion surprisingly went down. We're now at 6.8%, so that is pretty impressive. And yeah, under a 2,250 watt load, the engine speed came down kind of to the minimum acceptable level of 57 Hertz, and the voltage is pretty low at 102 volts. So we actually have about a 27, maybe a 28 volt drop, which is a little bit on the high side for something like this. Anyway, under this kind of a load, the sine wave looks cleaner, but you can see the peaks aren't as high. And that's due to the low voltage. And the THD, that is really good at about 8.9%. So from a power quality standpoint, this machine's doing quite well. So overall, this machine ran pretty well. I mean, it was very easy to start. The engine sounds great. And surprisingly, the total harmonic distortion was pretty good. I would say better than average. We maxed out at about 9%. As far as the engine performance goes, not as good as most machines. Usually you lose about 2 or 3 hertz from no load to full load. In this case, we didn't even make it to full load, and the engine had already slowed to 57 hertz. So, the engine could be down on power. The other possibility is that the governor is not sensitive enough. And I just took a look at where the governor spring is hooked in, and you can just see it right there. It's actually connected as far as it can be from that governor shaft. And like that, it's going to impact the sensitivity, and it's not going to maintain the engine speed as well. So, I was ready to call it, but now that I see that, I'm thinking we should move that spring, reset the speed, and see if it maintains its speed any better. So let's do that. We'll do another quick load test. We'll skip the power quality stuff and just see if we can get this performing any better. So it's kind of hard to get in here. You can't really see everything, but the adjustment screw is over there. And I'm going to back off the spring tension and move the spring, although technically I could probably do it without removing the spring tension, but we probably should, because this position here is increasing the spring tension, and I'm not sure, that's going to be enough. So I'm going to bring it all the way up here. And now that actually took spring tension off, but we are closer now to the governor shaft. So this is going to make it more sensitive. The only downside is if you move it too close, the engine's going to surge even though the engine is running fine, or I should say the carburetor is running fine. So, we'll start here. That should make a pretty noticeable difference. And we'll do the load test again, see if it maintains speed any better. And moving that spring made a very noticeable difference. Last time under 2,250 watts, we were barely holding on at 57 hertz, and I was afraid to add any more load to it. This time around, under the same load, we were holding at 58.5 hertz, which is a pretty typical response for that type of load. So I did momentarily overload it to 3,000 watts, and this time the engine did just fine. I didn't really sense any decrease in speed. So yeah, the governor sensitivity sometimes from the factory is not very good. And I don't know if it was set like that from the factory or if someone adjusted it along the way. Whatever the case is, it's now the way that it should be. So, I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.